Okay, so and this is the fourth video lecture in chapter one of sociology. The last lecture ended with me talking about sort of the all the different things you can learn from sociology. Now I want to talk about sort of the history or the origin of the discipline, and I'm just going to kind of big picture right here. But basically, Soc is a relatively new science. It originates in Europe at a time when there was a lot of social change happening. There were various revolutions. You have the American Revolution, which was challenging the relationship between people and leadership and government. A similar thing happening in France. You have an Industrial Revolution, which is very rapid social change. You have a lot of so it's really a time of a lot of social change, and some key thinkers were observing society and attempting to explain it. I mean, that's the nature really of all sciences, is all sciences are trying to understand or trying to explain something. And the science of society, which is really what sociology means, takes its takes its research methodology from the natural sciences. So maybe if you remember high school biology, where you learned about the research method, right, or the scientific method of make observations, make hypotheses, collect your data, and evaluate your data, sociology does the same thing. The difference is, the challenge is that in microbiology, or even when you're working, biology or plants or all of these things, you can control for all the variables. When we start talking about people, it's very difficult to control for all the variables, and quite frankly, it's unethical to do so. So Soc is forced to use other kind of statistical measurements, which I'm not going to get into, non-parametric data analysis, but it is forced to use another kind of methods. But nevertheless, it is a legitimate science. There are people, and I've had students who, argue that, well, it's an opinion. It's no, there are systematic processes used to come to these conclusions. What becomes opinion based is the different theoretical perspectives used to explain the data, right? But the data are what we would call social facts, right? The data that more than half of American marriages have ended before they get to their 12th anniversary. That is not an opinion. That is a fact. That is a social fact, right? The fact that there here at Salina Area Technical Colleges, there are more men in the construction science. That is not an opinion. That is a fact. How we explain why that is potentially opinion based, because I might use one theory to explain it. And here in just a second, I'm going to get to what the big three theories. But I want to talk about some of the founding sociological thinkers. We'll get to the big three, but some names to be familiar with, and maybe you've heard of them before. You have this fellow right here, and this is Auguste Comte. He is the fella that is credited with the coining the term sociology, and he's famous for this phenomena of positivism, where he applied the methods, the positivistic methods of counting and measuring in the animal kingdom, in the natural world, to society. Now, what Comte is, historians claim, he was really interested in perfecting society. So, for instance, we know in horticulture, and we know in farming, that if you eliminate the weak and the diseased, you will have a stronger crop. So one of the things that Comte is credited with is taking the same notion of, if you weed out the weak, you can make society stronger. Harriet Martineau, as this person here, and she's generally regarded as the first gender, or the first sociologist of gender. And she was a wealthy, privileged, educated woman when it was very unusual for women to be educated. And the story goes is that she wrote a book called Gender in Society. I have it underlined right here. It's the name of her book. And she was accounting or recollecting, describing what society was like for women. The story goes is that because it was considered really not feminine and inappropriate for women to read and write, she would write in her journal, and when someone would come in the room, she would put it under her dress because that was inappropriate. Now, Harriet is a product of her society, and so she's writing about women of privilege. She's not really writing about poor women, but what it was like for women of her social location. A name you might be familiar with is this fellow down here. This is Herbert Spencer. If you've ever heard the phrase survival of the fittest, that is not Charles Darwin. In fact, that is a term that Herbert Spencer used. He adopts or extends Charles Darwin's idea of adaptation, where the species that changes its body, right, in response to social or the environment is the ones who will survive. That's what evolution effectively is. It's the notion that the species that can adapt, right? The classic story is the birds on one side of the Galapagos Islands had long beaks, and the birds on the other side of the Galapagos Islands had short beaks. And the birds whose beaks had evolved had changed so that they could get to the seeds, so that they could eat the food. Those were the ones that survived. And in that sense, right, those, in that case, it's not the strong, but it's those who are willing to change and or able, not willing, because we're talking about animals. We're talking about able. But what Spencer does is he takes that same model and he applies it to society, and he calls it social Darwinism. And the idea is that those who can change in response to the larger social forces, those are the ones that are going to be successful. I think of social Darwinism as a really good, sort of pop culture in the story of The Walking Dead, right? So in The Walking Dead, the group that changes the way it behaves in order to meet the demands of, this dystopian society, those are the ones that change. Okay, then you have a few more founding members. Some of these people you may or may not be familiar with. This woman up here, Jane Addams. Jane Addams is credited with, she's considered one of the founding social worker. One of the interesting things about Jane Addams is you will see her referenced in introduction to social work textbooks, sociology textbooks, psychology textbooks. A lot of social scientists want to claim her as one of her own. She established, and here she's promoting Roads for Women. She was also a suffragette. She established something called the Hull House, which was a place in Chicago. You can still visit it on a tour. A place in Chicago for new immigrants to come. They would learn English. They would learn Americans' hygiene. They would learn high culture, like, things about the arts, all so that they could adapt and be accepted into their new cultural home and embraced, which indeed is the foundation of what social work is today. It's how do you help people work within the society in order to meet their goals and their needs. This guy here, W.E.B. Du Bois, he is credited as the first Black man to graduate from Harvard University. He wrote a book called The Souls of Black Folk, where he describes the relationship between black and white. He's also the founding member of the NAACP. And then this guy right down here, I'm not sure what I've done with my highlighting. This guy down here is Robert Merton. And we quoted him previously in another slide. I think that's who it is. We quoted him in another slide, or maybe anyway, it doesn't matter. He's a contemporary, and he is a functional theorist. So manifest versus latent functions is the idea we'll talk about in another theory, that everything in society has a function, serves some societal need. Manifest functions are the things that are obvious. Latent functions are the sort of, sometimes we call it the unspoken curriculum. So a classic example when we talk about higher ed education is the manifest function of going to school is to learn the knowledge, but the latent function of going to school, is also to learn the roles of like conformity and punctuality and respect for authority, but those aren't spelled out in the curriculum. Okay, I'm going to stop right here. And in the next slide, I'm going to start talk specifically about theory.